So welcome to the Invisible Years Made Visible project session. I'm going to introduce each of our presenters. First, I'm going to introduce Daphne Geismar, who is the author and designer of the book Invisible Years. Daphne plans, designs, and produces award-winning books on art and history for museums and publishers, including the Met and Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. For her MFA at Yale, Daphne's thesis project revealed new findings about Direction magazine, an anti-fascism periodical run by artists and writers at the outset of World War II. Daphne has taught design at the University of Connecticut and lectured at several colleges and universities. She's a volunteer with the Jewish Community Alliance for Refugee Resettlement. Daphne's here today to tell you about her collaborations with high school teachers to create and teach lessons on Holocaust history based on invisible years. Our second presenter is Colleen Sousa. She's a teacher. She teaches social studies at Fairfield Ludlowe High School and has been there for the past 19 years. She's taught all levels of world history with a focus of European studies and global politics. She currently serves as a department liaison in her district. So you all are in great hands today. I'm going to turn it over to our presenters.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We're excited to tell you about the work that we've been doing over the past year. So I first met Daphne, was lucky enough to meet Daphne last year on election day at a professional development that was put on by my curriculum leadership. And I was truly captivated by the book Invisible Years. Daphne shared with us her story of writing the book, of diving into her family's history, and she showed us beautiful images, and she ended with like a plug that said, "I'd love to work with teachers." So I thought, why not? So I reached out to Daphne, and it really was the beginning of a beautiful collaboration that I have found just really professionally and personally rewarding and enriching. And we're really excited today to tell you about a project that we together brainstormed, refined over a number of months, and what we eventually came up with. So I'm going to be telling you about my classes. I teach, one of my courses is AP European History. And I'm lucky that at the end of the school year, after the AP test is over, I have this chunk of time that I never felt like I was filling in a meaningful way. We would watch movies, we would play games, but the students towards the end of the curriculum really expressed a desire and an interest to learn more about the Holocaust than what I was able to kind of reasonably provide within the time constraints of preparing for the AP exam, especially like towards the end of the year when, you know, everything feels rushed. So in collaboration with Daphne, we decided to design this project to give them a really meaningful experience, to allow them to connect to the content of Invisible Years, to enhance some of the history that they already knew. So this is a picture of one of my classes. We did this project with 3 sections or 3 different groups of kids. And I figure their words are better than mine. This is some of the feedback that they give. In regular history, we are desensitized by the big numbers. Hearing the narrators of Invisible Years tell us what happened to them makes us understand. Reading the different perspectives out loud brought the story and the characters to life. We developed relationships with them. The dots were connected by people reacting personally to the history, telling how their lives changed and how their lives continued. We had learned about the Holocaust. However, this was the first time we felt honestly impacted by the horror and reality of the situation.
Thanks, Colleen, for that introduction to our collaboration, which we're very much looking forward to sharing with you today. I'm going to start this presentation with a quick look at Invisible Years, since the classroom project is based on both the book and the processes that I used to create it. My deep dive into my family history, specifically the years that they lived under German occupation in the Netherlands, began in 2006 when I learned that my maternal grandparents, Chaim and Fifi de Zutte, were hidden in a church attic in Rotterdam for 2 years. I visited the church that year with my mother, aunt, and other family members, 2 of which are here today, my cousins, Sharon and Hadassah. And they are also part of this project, which you will hear about. And when we were there, we met Kina, who's the granddaughter of the Reverend Gert and Gerda Brillenberg-Worth, who hid and saved our grandparents. Kina urged my mother and aunt to tell us urged my mother and aunt to tell us about their experiences in hiding, in addition to more about our other family members' experiences. And when I returned to the United States, I asked my mother to tell me more, which is when she led me to an antique desk and opened the bottom drawer. It was filled with my family members' letters, diaries, and documents about their experiences during the Holocaust. This Holocaust drawer contained voices from 2 generations. There were writings from 3 of my grandparents, and they were in their early 40s at the time, and my mother, father, aunts, and uncle who were adolescents. Often throughout this project, I also think about the projects or the voices that weren't in the drawer and how we don't have their stories. But the voices that were in the drawer became the narrators of my book. After translations were made and I read through the accounts, I realized that no one person had the complete story, but together they told their story and the history beautifully. In my kickoff presentation to the students, I explain how I cut up everyone's accounts, and then I made piles of the content groupings. Then I sequenced the groupings and excerpts within them. And this is how I created the first draft, which is an interwoven narrative of the voices. When I sat down to read that interwoven narrative in that draft form for the first time, it was like my family members were talking to one another and to me, and now to whoever reads the book. So by listening to this conversation, I finally understood how the genocide happened and how my family members felt when they lost their rights, freedom, identity, and the people they loved. I tell the students that my focus is my family's story and they are Jewish, but it's important to know that in addition to the planned mass murder of the Jews in Europe, the Nazis also wanted to destroy Roma, Slavs, LGBTQ people, Jehovah's Witnesses, people with physical or intellectual disabilities, and their political opponents. In the first 4 chapters of the book, the chapters titled Before, Trapped, Forbidden, and Separated, the narrators are coexisting. They're in their homes, living as families, in their communities, experiencing similar things. So their voices are interwoven in these chapters. But then in the chapter titled Invisible, the narrators go into hiding, and they all go into hiding separately. The children are separated from one another and from their parents. They're isolated, and their experiences in hiding are all very different from one another. So each narrator has a separate hiding chapter in the book. And then when the narrators come out of hiding and they're reunited in the chapter titled After, their voices become interwoven again. Each of the chapters opens with a historical introduction. These were written by the Holocaust scholar Robert Jan van Pelt. He also wrote a foreword for the book, and he also fact-checked and rewrote some of my history briefs. This kind of historical summary is also part of the student project. On this spread, you can see how the interwoven voices of the narrators work. It's the chapter that we're looking at is the chapter titled Forbidden, where the narrators tell about how life changed after each anti-Jewish law. And in this chapter only, the laws become an additional level of information woven into the tapestry. For example, one of the early decrees that was that Jewish civil servants were fired from their jobs. So my grandfather Chaim lost his job because he was a municipal pharmacist. And so after we see that decree in the text of this chapter, we then hear from Chaim and Fifi and their 3 young daughters in their own words about how that decree affected them. So the parents tell that they were worrying about how they were going to support the family. They all tell about having to move to a different town and a less expensive house. The girls have to leave their beloved school and friends, and other family members move in to share expenses. And so we hear about these experiences from adults and from children in their own ways. Also on the spread in the outside margin, you can see callouts for what I call history briefs that provide historical context for the personal accounts. So as I was first reading my family members' accounts, I had a lot of questions about people and facts and organizations and places that were coming up. And I answered my questions by doing research and then decided to include those findings as history briefs that kind of link to the personal stories, providing context for them. An example of the history briefs on the spread, you can see there's one for the Jewish Council, and 13-year-old David tells us about it, and also that his father, Erwin, was a volunteer for the Jewish Council. And there's also a history brief on the spread for the first German raid on the Jews. And this is one of the many details about the occupation that Erwin tells us about. That memoir of his really meticulously details the first 2 years of the occupation.
So as a history teacher, when I read the book for the first time after Daphne had initially presented it, this is what made me really gravitate towards it and want to turn this into a classroom experience, because this is what we hope for our students, right? For them to be able to contextualize some of the specific legislation, the specific laws, some of the more kind of factual things that are happening, to be able to contextualize that, to really understand people's personal experiences and to have empathy for them. For me, I experienced that as a reader, and I really wanted to recreate that for them as a mother in my 40s, reading about all of these laws that as a history teacher I already knew, reading the experiences of these parents having to come to grips with what was happening, but then think, oh my gosh, I have to now get my children through this. How am I going to keep them safe? Where am I going to put them? I had such a visceral, emotional experience reading it that I thought that was such a powerful experience to then replicate for students, because there are voices of kids their own age and them having to reconcile living through, again, this factual history. How do we personalize it and make it real for them?
So Colleen and I are gonna read just a few excerpts just to give you the smallest of tastes about how the narrative reads. April 15th, 1941, Jews are given 2 weeks notice to surrender their radios. June 4th, 1941, Jews are prohibited from using public beaches and swimming baths and attending public markets.
Erwin, age 39, after radios were confiscated in the spring 1941 and we were prohibited from cafes and bars in the summer, Jews could not travel without a permit.
Natan, every year there was a fair in Apeldoorn. This year was no exception. Signs forbidding entry for Jews were displayed. I once went anyway, but did not enjoy it since I felt like a fugitive.
David, aged 11. We wondered, why are we losing everything when we are no different from our friends who aren't Jewish?
Miriam, you were a non-person, a person people didn't want to associate with. You were different. Maybe you are bad because the Germans said Jews are bad. It makes you feel like you are nothing. I'm jumping ahead to the chapter titled Invisible after the chapter opener, which opens with an introduction and a timeline. There's this map of the hiding addresses of the 8 narrators. In total, the map shows 27 documented hiding addresses for 8 people. because in the first year of hiding, there was a lot of moving around to find a safe hiding address. And then after, around late 1942, 43, it just became too dangerous to change hiding at places. In addition to the text, photographs and artifacts are a big part of the book and also the classroom project. What we're looking at here is a false ID that allowed my grandmother, Greta, to hide in plain sight, posing as a non-Jewish maid. She didn't write about her experiences, and she's one of those voices that isn't in the drawer. And this is really all that I know from my father, from something my father wrote once, is that she was posing as a non-Jewish maid, and I really wish we had her story. At the end of the project, I bring in the actual artifacts for the students once they really know the people and about the artifacts, and that's a really powerful moment. And this high school students are always really interested in the false ID. This is my grandfather Erwin's memoir that he wrote while in hiding. And until I found this in the Holocaust drawer, I knew almost nothing about him. Erwin wrote these 49 pages in 2 months. He started writing 2 days after he said goodbye to his son, who's my father, who left the Amsterdam apartment that Erwin was hiding in for farm country in the north, where they hoped it would be safer. They didn't feel it was safe in this Amsterdam apartment because there were a lot of people coming and going. Both Erwin in this memoir and David in his account write about the moment they said goodbye. And neither of them ever read what each other wrote. But in the book, their experiences come together. Erwin's writing ends abruptly when he was captured in his apartment and murdered in Auschwitz. And I didn't find Erwin's memoir until after my father died, which is why he never read that. Erwin's memoir includes these words. In the end, I hope that my lines will be read by people who will see how we struggled under terrible circumstances, and that the reader will want to take up this struggle that we have fought and experienced from the front lines for the construction of a worthwhile, humane society.
So when it came time to sit down and plan and design a project, we decided to start with formulating an essential question to really guide and focus our work and our intention with what we wanted the students to get out of this experience. And we went back and forth with a lot of different questions, and I kept thinking about that quote that Daphne just read that I had in my personal copy of the book, like circled and highlighted, and I had a million sticky notes because it impacted me so significantly that we decided to abandon all of the questions that we had come up with and actually turn that quote into an essential question for the students. So the guiding question that we sought to answer or attempt to answer is, how can we study the struggles fought and experienced, by others in order to construct a more worthwhile and humane society? Which is a really big question, but I think we did have some success, at least talking it through. So this is an outline, and we're going to go into more detail, but this is an outline of the actual project that we came up with. So we knew that we wanted to do 3 things. The first thing we wanted to do was we wanted to use the narratives in the book to help students get a better understanding of the history of the Holocaust through using personal experiences. So we used excerpts of the book. Daphne curated content from each of the chapters, but then also the individual hiding stories of her family members to give students to use as a springboard for formulating questions, conducting their own research, having an interview. So that was phase 1. We also wanted to address modern anti-Semitism by helping students recognize that this is still something that is going on, as well as equip them with the tools to recognize it when they see it, and then how to meaningfully speak out in a way that they would actually engage in that felt authentic to them. And then the last thing that we wanted them to do was to do some research on modern conflicts and human rights conflicts throughout the world, where they could conduct a similar process of looking at personal stories, using those personal stories to create an interwoven narrative, as well as doing some factual research. And the end piece, where we connect back to the essential question, was having them identify patterns that exist between or amongst different human rights events, and then most importantly, defining and articulating lessons for the global community to prevent future human rights atrocities. So this is our list of objectives. So in the first part, students will connect Holocaust history to personal stories and bring the voices of the storytellers to life. Connect with the narrators, but also to connect with Daphne. We were so lucky that Daphne made herself available to my students, which was not easy. She had to come to Fairfield at 7:30 in the morning some days, so I was very appreciative that she did that. Have students learn to ask good questions and conduct interviews as well as research. We wanted the students to have safe conversations about prejudice today, for them to select and research contemporary human rights conflict from which they would create an interwoven narrative using primary source material. They would identify patterns that exist between human rights events and then define lessons to prevent atrocities in the future.
In our first working class, we had the students gather in small groups to carry out a reading of the narrator's interwoven voices from the early chapters, mostly Trapped and Forbidden, but a little bit about their lives before the war. So here you can see on the blackboard, there are the names of the narrators, and then the students broke into groups and each chose a narrator, and within their groups of 6 or 7 people, they did a reading aloud. And one student took on the anti-Jewish decrees or the laws for their reading. One student described to us what the reading aloud experience was like to her. And she said, "We are reading for them, speaking for them. They are in our body." That was how she felt after the experience of doing this reading.
So this is a photo of a few of the students engaged in the group reading. Some of them at first, I think, were a little skeptical when we asked them to take roles and to sit and read it out loud because the selection was quite long. They were like a play, like they were a little hesitant, but as soon as they started, you could tell that they just like settled and immediately took it really seriously. We asked them to highlight and annotate the reading as they went with anything that they wanted to circle back and discuss, or to write down any questions they had for follow-up at the end, but we wanted the reading itself to happen in an unbroken way so that they would do all of the discussion after. Once it was over, then we had them reflect and we had a larger class discussion. So these are, I won't read all of them, but this is a few of the comments that they had. It struck me how the German soldiers found amusement in torturing and instilling fear. They made David crawl like a dog and lick the ground. The horror became normal. They had to live with it. They couldn't do anything about it. It happened slowly, then the Nazis destroyed everything. We could see the human effects of the anti-Jewish decrees by the way the personal experiences related to the laws. When Miriam wrote, "You are different, it makes you feel like you are nothing," I could see how the Nazis really wanted to make them different, to separate them, to dehumanize them. When she told about seeing her father cry on the front steps, it struck me as the moment of lost innocence. So just in one class period, they were able to make a lot of personal connections and get a lot out of it.
After the students did the group reading, we asked them to choose a narrator to follow into hiding. Is my dog barking? You can all hear.
It's okay.
You can, as long as you can hear me.
Yep.
Okay. They so from the group reading, they have a sense of the narrative, And we also give them a one paragraph summary of each of the narrators' hiding experience, because each of those experiences are so different from one another. Some of them could never leave their hiding places, while others hid in plain sight. There were Nazi raids on 2 of the hiding places. My maternal grandparents and the Bright Plain Church in Rotterdam were not discovered, but their account includes the telling of the story of the raid. And my paternal grandfather was captured, and we hear about that raid from the son of the woman who hid him, who I found after, like, many years after discovering Erwin's diary. Some hiding accounts read like adventure stories and even contain some humor, while others are much more tragic. Most of the protectors, so the people who helped, were remarkable humanitarians, but one was a Nazi sympathizer, and the father and 2 sons of one family were abusive. So from the summary, students see that each experience is really unique and that all hiding stories are not the same. And they then select the person that they most connected with, or who interested them, or whose voice they liked and they wanted to follow into hiding.
So this photograph shows just the physical copies of the hiding stories. We did have the students use physical copies as opposed to posting, because we really wanted them to work on annotating, kind of digging in deeply into the text, which maybe I'm old school, but I like them to do that on paper with pencil. So again, it was about them choosing the hiding story that they felt a connection with. As I said earlier, I would have picked Erwin, he is the parent, or Hyman Fifi, because they're parents and that's what I connect with. So we really encourage them to pick someone where they could feel that connection. And the initial instruction was to take the packet and to give it a read through. They were to underline, circle, annotate, ask questions of the text, similar to what they did during the initial group reading, but in preparation, so this was like a homework assignment, in preparation for the next class, the second class, they were to have prepped their hiding story.
So after the students have read through their hiding story once, I take them through an exercise of how to ask good questions from the stories, photographs, and artifacts. And I want to give a shout out to my dear friend and colleague, Renee Lusky, who's here. She's an art educator, and I learned this process from her, and she and I actually did some workshop together using the content from Invisible Years, this Asking Questions workshop. So it's part of our classroom project. And here you can see the beginning of Miriam's story to represent that the students have this text, and also a photograph of her with 3 other children that she was hidden with. She didn't know them before she was in hiding, and a letter and drawing that Miriam wrote to her parents while hiding. Together, we worked as a group with this content of Miriam's as an example. So all students wrote and contributed questions based on exercise prompts. And by doing that, they discovered that there are so many different questions that can be asked from a short text or a single image. And using the visual objects allows students to make really detailed observations that can then, those details, those visual details can actually be turned into questions. Some of the prompts encourage questions that are really specific, and others encourage questions about the bigger picture. And we talk, once we, share the questions and talk about how they might be answered, we also talk about how some of the questions are much more personal and emotional, and some are about the truths and the facts of the history. One question that students ask about Miriam's note to her parents is, how was it? How is it possible that this letter was actually delivered between 2 different hiding places? And when I first found this note, I had that same question. After a long search, I discovered this document which answers that question. It's what you're looking at is a letter from Miriam's father, Chaim, my grandfather, and he writes that a resistance worker named Hendrika Deckers was their link with the children. this letter and 13 others that my grandfather wrote about the people who helped them they weren't in the Holocaust drawer. They were at Yad Vashem, where he had submitted them, hoping that the those who helped would be accepted as righteous among nations for helping Jews. It's an organization that honors non-Jews for helping Jews during the Holocaust. And I had no idea that those letters existed. I go further into the process of how I found this letter with the students, and I talk about how this document led to many more questions.
So this, I think, was one of the most important parts of the project for students to see Daphne model historical thinking skills in real time, and how asking questions leads to more questions, leads to more information that you didn't even necessarily know that you didn't know, which would then prompt future questions. So after they did the question workshop, they went back and did a second close read of their hiding story for the purpose of writing as many questions as they could. And we had them categorize the questions into 3 columns. So they sorted them in a big graphic organizer. Questions for an interview, because the next class they were going to be interviewing Daphne and her cousins, so the children of the narrators. Questions for research, because they would eventually pick 2 of their questions to do research on and write a history brief. And then questions that can't be answered, things that are more emotional. And when I looked at the document, I realized that we actually needed more time on working on our questions. And that was surprising to me a little bit, that they needed more work, and they didn't have enough practice in constructing good questions. So we did have to workshop them a little bit, but these are some examples of the questions that they came up with for conducting the interview. What was it like for Miriam to be stripped of her identity in order to survive? After the war, was she able to regain a sense of identity? Why didn't David's father go with him to Friesland where it was safer? Why did children hide separately from their parents? How did David's experience of human kindness during his hiding shape his perspective on humanity as a whole? Why did Natan feel safer with the yellow star when it was essentially a target on his back? So they then had the opportunity to ask these questions through an interview with Daphne, Sharon, and Hadassah, her cousins, who were generous enough with their time to allow my students to ask them questions. So this is a picture of one of the Zoom calls. We had 3 Zoom calls. I believe Sharon and Hadassah might be here. So hi, so good to see you again. Again, thank you so much for doing this for my students. On the following slide, we have an excerpt of the Q&A, but I will say personally, watching my students conduct this interview was one of the most worthwhile experiences that I've had in my 19 years of teaching. It was very emotional. It felt very intense. They were enthralled. I've never seen such a high level of engagement. When it was over, they didn't want to leave the room. They just kind of sat there for a few minutes to process, and they walked out of the room saying things like, wow. I think for many of them who still come back and talk to me about this, this was a really defining moment, because I think they felt very empowered that they would be given access to the time of people who would be generous enough. Even with a lot of these answers were very emotional. And here's an example. So one of my students, Victoria, asked, when Judith wrote the letter to you, her daughters, about the abuse she experienced in hiding, how did you feel? How did you shape your view of the war and the cost of survival? That's a deeply personal, complicated question. And the answer was so beautiful. And I was just so appreciative of the seriousness with which Daphne and her family members took their questions. And I think that the students really, really felt empowered by that. The answer, Hadassah, it was like getting hit in the stomach. It ruined the word righteous for me. The man who saved her also held her captive. She had nowhere to go. He ruthlessly took advantage of the situation. She was very, very young. It had been absolute for me that people who saved Jews in the war were good people. After I learned my mother's story when we were working on the book, I understood that everything is much more complex. People who did the saving are not just good, and people who looked aside are not bad. There are many ways to act in a complex situation. It changed my view of people overall. The truth is very complex.
As Colleen mentioned, we broke the questions down into categories of questions that can be asked in an interview, questions that can be answered through research, and questions that can never be answered. And some of those are the best questions of all. We're just going to share a few of the research questions with you that came up from that asking questions exercise. Earlier, I mentioned that the history briefs that link to the personal stories, and there are about 60 of them in Invisible Years. Following this idea, each student researched and wrote 2 history briefs based on the questions that they came up with from asking questions from the narrative and the picture and the artifact. And then they shared all of their history briefs in a group document. So these are just a few of the questions that turned into history briefs that the students first researched and then wrote history briefs for. How much popular support was there for Nazism among the Dutch people? Was the Dutch resistance widespread and effective? To what extent did resistance differ between Jews and non-Jews? How difficult was it to obtain false IDs, and how convincing were they? How did leaders and organizations outside Nazi-occupied territories respond to the plight of Jews during the Holocaust? After working on their own with their hiding stories, students then gathered in their original groups again for a reading of the chapter titled After. After the liberation of the Netherlands is when the narrators' voices come back together again as the narrators emerge from their hiding places and find one another. At that time, they also found that most of their family and friends had been murdered.
So at the conclusion of reading the After, we asked the students what surprised them. And these were some of the comments that they made. They talked about a lot about being, well, it was interesting. We said, what surprised you, but actually shouldn't have surprised you, or like it was surprising, not shocking, that when you really think about it, of course, you know, the time following would be full of pain and trauma. They talked a lot about the comments from the narrators about their guilt, their survivor's guilt, the persistent fear. One of them talked about that they found it surprising that David found Jewish religious life to be BS. That was one of the quotes that the students said. And one of the things that also came out of the conversation is they did have a lot of questions that turned into like more historical conversations. For example, they talked about, or we had a conversation about how religion was used or turned into a race by the Nazis as a mechanism for dehumanization, and the reality of just the concept of race and having no biological validity. A lot of the students had questions actually about the creation of Israel, because many of the narrators moved to Israel after the war was over. So we talked about UN Resolution 181 and the founding of the Jewish state. That was not history that they were necessarily familiar with. So this initial conversation turned into a larger conversation where they had that ability to kind of ask all of those remaining lingering questions that they had. And the last thing that we asked students to do to close out this first phase of the project is to write their narrator a letter. And we kept the parameters very loose. We just said, what would you say to your narrator if you could? And here are some of the responses. So this first one is to Erwin. To be frank, I am unsure how satisfied you would be with society's current progress towards being more humane. Human rights have greatly increased over the past 80 years, yet there are still many groups who are treated poorly. There are genocides going on no one seems to particularly care about. As you may be able to tell, your story has had great impact on me. On the surface, I have little connection with you. You spoke a different language, lived across the world, were over 20 years older than I currently am. You had a wife and a child, while I obviously have neither. However, your writing voice truly speaks to me because it resembles my own, and I share your hopes and worries for the future and how we'll change. For you, for me, and for everyone, I will try my hardest to take up this struggle that you have fought and experienced from the front lines for the construction of a worthwhile, humane society. Xavier.
Do you want to read the other Irwin
Sure.
too, Colleen?
What impacted me the most was that in the book, it went between your and other people's narrations, but at one point, your narration completely stopped. I was reading Hans and Dieter's account, waiting for you to come back, but you never did. That you were taken to your death is so heartbreaking. Eve.
Here's a couple more examples of the student letters to the narrators. Judith, it is shocking to me that this was a true event. I can't imagine how it must have felt to have to pretend to be someone else and uphold a completely different identity, just so that no one would find out that you're Jewish. It really impacted me when I found out that you all survived, yet didn't recognize each other because you had all become different people during your time in hiding. Dear Miriam, I wanted to start by saying that I am so impressed with your maturity level. You made me realize that during times of survival, you become a person that you sometimes don't even imagine yourself becoming. I hope one day I can be as strong as you, Amber.
And then last, dear Natan, we've been on quite the journey. Prior to reading your story, I never truly felt the gravity of the atrocities committed. When reading about something like the Wannsee conference, I wouldn't bat an eye because I was so disconnected from the actions that happened. You surprised me in many ways. You may have been hiding and trying to escape the Nazis who wanted to kill you, but above all, you made me realize that every person who was lost was truly human with unique experiences. When you talked about how you practiced your English and played chess with aircrew members, I sensed how we were both inquisitive children. When you learned geography by listening to BBC updates and marking it on the map, that made me feel so connected because I love geography. I walk away from your invisible years remembering that every human in the Holocaust had a story. They were all humans similar to us. Society cannot anticipate change unless we make these invisible years visible to everyone. Samitha.
So as Colleen explained before, when we looked at the snapshot of the project, midway through the project pivots to the present. And at that point, I share a personal experience I had with anti-Semitism. It happened in the early days of the COVID shutdown during the second Zoom presentation I ever gave for my book. This is a screenshot of what happened during this presentation, but what I showed the students is a 30-second clip of the actual recorded video where somebody shouts, "Haha, the Holocaust never happened." And then I also showed them about a 1-minute clip of the hackers drawing graffiti throughout the images that are the artifacts of my family members' experiences, such as this page of my grandfather's diary that includes his drawing of his hiding place in the attic of the Bright Plain Church. And then I talk about how it felt to have this happen and how the only control I had was in how I responded, and that I was only able to go on with the presentation because of the other people who were there. They were both friends and strangers and colleagues, but they were all supporting me and encouraging me to continue. And they helped stop the Zoom bombing. And they sort of provided the support in the moment and also afterwards. And then after sharing this experience, I talk about why Holocaust denial is so dangerous. And I talk about the increase in anti-Semitic incidents. With Colleen's class, it was last spring. And then just this fall, I taught with Joe from E.O. Smith, and he's on here today. And it was equally a, sort of wonderful experience of, that the project sort of exceeding our expectations and how it connected with the students. And since we were teaching this right after October 7th, the increase in anti-Semitic acts and also in anti-Muslim hate, had risen exponentially. And so there's an opportunity to talk about that.
So after Daphne shared the Zoom bomb incident, we just opened it up to their reactions. And at this point, the students knew Daphne and had made connections with her. So they were really sad that it happened to her. And I think they really felt it. And they had pretty emotional responses that someone that they knew and were connected with had experienced this. We supported it with a handout from the organization Facing History and Ourselves that they have of modern anti-Semitic tropes. So we went through it with them and we talked about what you should be looking for, what are some of the common things that you'll see online so that you could recognize it as anti-Semitism when you see it. And we were surprised but not shocked that a lot of them had seen these tropes before. They were like, oh, yeah, we recognize this. We've seen this almost casually. They were like, yeah, we've seen this before. Yeah, I've seen this one. I've seen this one. And for me as an adult who doesn't live in the internet space that they live in, I found that really shocking. And then we asked them if anyone would feel comfortable sharing any anti-Semitism or any hate speech or action that they had ever personally experienced. And at this point, just the background again is that it was May and I had been with these students all year and they had been with Daphne for weeks at this point. So I do feel like we had enough of a trusting relationship and a safe space built up for them to share, but they really shared. It was very upsetting for me as an adult to be listening to some of the things that had been said to them or things that they had experienced. But it was a really good, I think, productive conversation because the focus really was, well, when that happens, what do you do? And what I would do as an adult and what I would say, like, that's not appropriate. We don't use those words. That's not language that is acceptable. That they're not going to say that. So what could they say to develop an actual planned response? In some cases it was, and that's why this is on the screen, like, dude, what the hell? If someone says something in the cafeteria that makes you uncomfortable, look at them and say, dude, what the hell? Or why is that funny? Or what do you mean by that? And give them in their vernacular a go-to response that they would feel comfortable in the moment using. And interestingly, this fall, a couple of students came back and said that they did actually use the thing that they had prepared in class when they were confronted with some speech that made them uncomfortable. So the final phase of the project was to now transition it back to looking at another human rights issue or atrocity. We gave them a list of ideas, but we allowed them to bring in, their own experiences or their own interests and choose something that they wanted. Some of them actually brought in their own family history, and they researched things that were personal to them. So this is just a sample list of what we gave them and some of the topics that my students covered, where they were going to apply a lot of what we had done previously with the Invisible Years content to a new conflict.
What students then do is they investigate their topic using the same methods that I and then they use to learn about the Holocaust. So they weave together excerpts from personal stories that they find through research. And we ask them to show at least 2 different perspectives or experiences. They ask questions from those stories, they refine those questions to drive their research, and then they write their history briefs for their issue that link to the story, and they also write a historical summary for their issue. And what happens by weaving together more than one voice, they see people as unique individuals. They see that all people in a given group aren't the same, that they might have different beliefs, opinions, morals, personalities. And they see that this means that persecuting an entire group of people doesn't make sense.
So this is a photograph from the presentation / discussion period where we went around the room and each of the groups shared their history brief. They gave a brief overview of the conflict that they had chosen, and then they did a group reading of the narrative that they had constructed, just like we had done with the content from Invisible Years. Once everyone had presented, then we started to look for and identify patterns. So in my class, we did it as a large group discussion, almost like a Socratic seminar format. This photograph is from Joe's class, where they listed on the board a lot of the patterns and trends that they saw. And in both classes, they came up with very similar things. So this is the list of patterns that they identified. Propaganda, which manipulates a collective acceptance of lies, scapegoating, which creates a division between us and them, manufactured identifiers, which separates the targeted group, dehumanization, makes it possible to treat others badly, discriminatory laws slowly take away rights, fear and censorship influence society so they are quiet, a charismatic leader that inspires devotion and obedience, and lack of empathy from other nations, which ultimately leads to apathy. And then as the end piece of this, we transition from patterns to prevention. And we ask the students, how do we prevent things like this from happening? And how do we build education for more citizens to prevent things like this from happening? And this is what they came up with. Education, empathy, helping to create personal connections among groups of people, respect and listening to others. This is an interesting one that we talked a lot about. One of the students said, does propaganda have to be bad or have to be false? Can we use positive propaganda or propaganda in reverse? They talked about having a more proactive UN or government organization and institutions, more diverse representation in media, an expansion of women's rights, and recognition of leaders who inflame hatred or inflame other groups.
And I'm just going to throw in, so these are sort of the summaries of what they said, but what's so wonderful is they're each finding specific examples within their own event and what they learned about the Holocaust. So they're offering the examples, which we don't have the time to get into here. So this is more of a summary.
So we did collect feedback at several stages from the students. All students said that this project should continue to be taught. All students said that they found a personal connection with their Invisible Years narrator. Many of them said that they wish that the unit was longer, and many of them asked me to borrow my copy of the book. Then they went on to read the complete book, which was really great.
And here are, we'll sort of close with a few quotes that the students, at the end, we asked them some questions to give us feedback so we could improve the project. And these are some of the specifics of what they said. This project dramatically increased my understanding of the Holocaust. It was eye-opening to go in depth on a personal level with the narrators of Invisible Years. I had learned about the Holocaust. However, this was the first time I felt honestly impacted by the horror and reality of the situation. Before, I knew the facts, but I couldn't explain their effects. Getting to share my research with everyone in the class and getting to hear theirs was amazing in the worst way. In everyone's interwoven narratives, there were pieces that related to someone else's, even though the events were years apart. The discussion on the last day of class was helpful in connecting everything we learned to our own lives. I have taken the message and information about human rights conflict out of the box of Euro and broadened it to the scope of my day-to-day life. This project had a huge impact on my way of thinking about the world. And this last one I had to throw in, it's also from Joe Goldman's class, not Colleen's, because I also just love this. The lessons will stick with me for the rest of my life. It genuinely gave more insight on the struggles people suffer because of human rights abuses, most critically, the post-war perspectives of survivors. We could have a whole conversation on the power of, and the students would often say that usually everything ends with the end of the war, and realizing that, that what happens is it doesn't end, and there is sorrow for the rest of their lives. So now we're gonna both open it up to questions and maybe talk a little bit about how this project can be used in whole or in part in the classroom.